At some point in the last 5 years, you have probably apologized for something that was not your fault. Maybe you apologized for being in someone's way when they were the one who walked into you. Maybe you apologized for asking a question that should not have required an apology. Maybe you apologized for having a feeling that was entirely reasonable and proportionate, and that the person in the room with you made you feel was too large for the space. One apology. One moment of misplaced accountability. You know how that felt. The small deflation of it. The way it sits in your chest for a few minutes before the day moves on and takes it with it. Now multiply that by 7 years. Multiply it by every significant decision you made in that period. Multiply it by every conflict and every tension and every moment of friction in your most intimate relationship. Multiply it by the version of yourself you had constructed by the end of those 7 years. A version built almost entirely from the accumulated weight of responsibility for things that were not yours to carry. A version that had become so accustomed to the posture of self-blame that self-blame was no longer a response to specific events. It was just how she moved through the world. It was her default setting. It was, by the time she finally sat across from someone who asked her the right question, so thoroughly installed in her nervous system that she could not have identified the original moment of installation any more than she could have identified the first breath she ever took. That is where this story begins. Not with a discovery, not with a confrontation, not with a phone or a document or a revelation. It begins with a question. One question asked by one person in one room that started undoing 7 years of carefully constructed damage. Welcome to Venom Thread. This is the most quietly devastating story we have ever told. Her name was Iris, and she was 38 years old when she walked into a therapist's office for what she described to the intake coordinator as stress management. That was the phrase she used. Stress management. Because she did not yet have a word for what she was actually there for, which was the particular exhaustion of a woman who had spent 7 years being the designated problem in a relationship she had also been the primary architect of. She had built the home. She had managed the finances. She had coordinated the social life and the holiday plans and the communication with both families and the 1,000 invisible operational tasks that constitute the infrastructure of a shared life. She had done all of this while also being, within that same relationship, the person whose emotional responses were consistently too large, too unpredictable, too demanding, too present. She had been simultaneously indispensable and excessive, the backbone of everything and the liability of everything. She had maintained this contradiction for 7 years without being able to name it as a contradiction because the man who had constructed it, her partner, a man named Daniel, was genuinely excellent at maintaining it. He had a quality that she would later identify, with the help of the therapist and a considerable amount of research conducted alone at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, as strategic emotional inconsistency. He was warm exactly often enough to make the coldness interpretable as circumstantial. He was present exactly often enough to make the absence feel like her failure to make the space welcoming. He was everything exactly enough to make everything always her fault. The question the therapist asked in the third session was not dramatic. It was not the kind of question that arrives in a movie with a swell of music and a close-up on the face of the person receiving it. It was quiet and specific, and it arrived in the middle of a sentence Iris was already finishing, a sentence in which she was explaining why she had been difficult during a particular argument with Daniel, cataloging her own failures of patience and communication and emotional regulation with the fluency of someone who had rehearsed this catalog many times. The therapist waited for Iris to finish, and then she said, "When you describe that argument, I notice you've accounted very thoroughly for everything you did wrong. Can you tell me one thing Daniel did wrong in that same argument?" And Iris opened her mouth, and closed it, and opened it again, and sat for an amount of time that she would later describe as embarrassingly long, trying to locate, in her memory of that argument, a single failure on Daniel's part that she had not immediately explained away as a response to something she had done first. She could not find one, not because Daniel had been blameless, but because she had spent 7 years in a relationship where the accounting was structurally imbalanced, where her errors were recorded in permanent ink and his errors were recorded, if they were recorded at all, in pencil that she had been handing him the eraser for. She went home from that session, and she did something she had not done in years. She sat alone in the kitchen without turning on the television or picking up her phone, and she thought. Not about Daniel specifically. About the accounting. About the ledger of the relationship as she experienced it in her body. The specific physical weight of carrying responsibility for the emotional climate of a 7-year partnership. She thought about the arguments she remembered most clearly, and she tried, for the first time, to reconstruct them from the position of an observer rather than a defendant. What she found when she looked at them from that position was not a sudden clear picture of Daniel as a villain. It was something more disorienting than that. What she found was that in every significant conflict she could remember, by the time the conflict had resolved, she had accepted responsibility for the part she had played, and also for the part Daniel had played, and also for the conditions that had made the conflict likely, and also for the emotional aftermath that Daniel experienced as a result of a conflict that she was by that point carrying entirely alone. She had been apologizing for the weather while he stood in the rain she had been blamed for causing. This is a specific kind of mathematics. The kind where the equation always balances, but only because one person is always making up the difference. She started writing it down, not as a journal. She had tried journaling during the relationship, and Daniel had found it once and had said, with the specific tone of patient concern he deployed in these situations, that he worried about her spending so much time examining her own thoughts, because in his experience that kind of inward focus tended to make people more anxious rather than less, and she had stopped. What she wrote now was different. It was a list. A simple numbered list of the specific things she had apologized for in the last year of the relationship. She did this from memory over the course of 2 evenings, and the list reached 63 items before she stopped, not because she had run out of items, but because 63 was already more than she could sit with. She looked at the 63 items. She read through them the way you read through a document you are checking for errors, looking for the pattern beneath the specific instances. And the pattern she found was not that she had been wrong 63 times. The pattern was that 41 of the 63 items were things she had apologized for that had originated as responses to Daniel's behavior. She had apologized for her responses. The behavior that generated the responses was not on the list. It had never been on any list. It had never been the subject of any conversation in which accountability was the outcome. She had been so thoroughly trained to focus on her own reactions that the actions generating those reactions had become invisible. He had not done this through cruelty. That is the part that took the longest to accept. He had done it through consistency and patience, and the slow drip of 1,000 small conversations in which her interiority was always the variable under examination. The research she did at her kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night over the following weeks introduced her to a vocabulary she had not previously had access to. Words and frameworks and clinical descriptions that she read with the specific recognition of someone who has been living inside a thing for years without knowing the thing had a name. She read about covert emotional abuse. She read about the specific dynamic in which one partner's emotional responses are consistently pathologized while the other partner's behavior is consistently framed as reactive rather than originating. She read about the way long-term exposure to this dynamic reshapes a person's relationship to their own interiority, the way it installs a kind of internal critic that speaks in the voice of the person doing the pathologizing, so that eventually the person being managed begins to manage themselves, and the external manager becomes almost unnecessary. She read about this, and she felt, in sequence, recognition, and then nausea, and then something that was not quite anger, and not quite grief, but contained elements of both. Recognition because everything she read described her experience with a precision she had not encountered in 7 years of living it. Nausea because the precision meant it was not unique to her relationship. It was a documented pattern with a documented mechanism and a documented effect on the person on the receiving end of it. And the third feeling, the one that was not quite anger and not quite grief, because she was beginning to understand that the 7 years she had spent blaming herself had not been a private failure of self-awareness. They had been the predictable outcome of a specific process. She had not fallen into self-blame. She had been placed there. She told Daniel she was leaving on a Wednesday afternoon in November. She had chosen the timing and the location deliberately. She had read enough by that point to understand that the conversation needed to happen in a neutral space with a clear exit available to her. And she had told a friend where she would be and had arranged for the friend to call her at a specific time if she did not check in. These were not paranoid precautions. Daniel had never been physically threatening. But she had learned enough about the architecture of the dynamic she had been living in to understand that the conversation she was about to have would be a final demonstration of every behavior she had spent 7 years absorbing, and she wanted to observe it clearly rather than be absorbed by it one more time. She was right. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. In those 40 minutes, Daniel moved through a sequence of responses that she had seen before in different combinations, but never at this speed and this concentration. First, the patient concern. Are you sure you're in a good place to be making this decision? I've noticed you've been more anxious lately. Then the gentle reframing. I think what you might be feeling is the cumulative stress of the last few months, which has been hard on both of us. Then, when those did not produce the reconsideration he was accustomed to producing, a version of the original technique stripped of its usual patience. A direct statement that her perception of their relationship was a product of the anxiety she had struggled with throughout, and that she was making a decision from inside a distorted reading of things that had been much better than she was currently remembering them. He was, in the final act of their 7-year relationship, doing exactly what he had always done. He was making her perception of reality the variable. He was making her the problem. He had never done anything else. She sat, and she listened to all 40 minutes of it. And then she said, I hear you. I am leaving anyway. And she did. The period that followed the leaving was not simple. She wants that acknowledged because the story of leaving an emotionally abusive relationship is often told with a clean narrative line. The realization, the exit, the recovery, the empowerment. That does not adequately represent the actual texture of the experience, which is nonlinear and contradictory, and contains grief for things that were not real alongside fury at the years spent grieving for them. She missed Daniel. This is the thing she was most reluctant to tell me, and the thing she insisted most strongly that I include, because she believed it was the most important truth of the experience for people who were inside their own version of it. She missed him with a completeness that coexisted with her understanding of what he had done, because love, even love that has been manufactured and managed and deployed as a mechanism of control, does not dissolve cleanly when the understanding arrives. It sits in the body longer than the mind wants it to. It generates the specific grief of mourning someone who was not who you believed them to be, which is in some ways worse than mourning someone who simply left, because the grief has nowhere clean to go. You cannot grieve him accurately because the him you are grieving did not entirely exist. And you cannot stop grieving him because the love you developed in response to his performance was real, even if the performance was not. The self-blame was the last thing to dissolve. She said this carefully, and she said it as a warning to anyone who was earlier in the process than she was at the time we spoke. The realization that the self-blame had been installed rather than earned did not immediately remove the self-blame. It changed its quality. It changed it from a weight she carried as something foreign, something that had been put inside her by someone else, and that she was now working to remove. But removal is not instant. The internal critic that had been trained to speak in Daniel's voice did not retire when Daniel left. It continued to operate with the same fluency it had been given, applying the same framework to new situations in her life, finding the same entry points in her new responses to new events. She was, for a considerable period after leaving, still doing Daniel's work for him inside her own head, still generating the accounting that found her at fault, still arriving at apologies for things that did not require apologies. And she dealt with this not by willing it away, but by continuing with the therapist and by maintaining the list, adding to it over time, not new apologies from the relationship, but new instances in her post-relationship life, where she caught the internal critic mid-sentence and asked it whose voice it was using. The catching was the work. It was slow and repetitive and not cinematic in any way. It was just one woman in a kitchen asking herself the same question until the question became a reflex, and the reflex began to replace the critic. The realization she described as chilling, her word, used twice, and I think it is the right word, came not at the beginning of the understanding but near the middle of it. About 8 months after leaving, when she had enough perspective to look back at the full arc of the 7 years with the vocabulary she had accumulated and the distance she had built. The chilling realization was not about Daniel specifically. It was about time. About what 7 years of internalized self-blame had cost her in terms of the specific choices she had not made, the paths she had not taken, the versions of herself she had not developed because she had been fully occupied with the management of her own inadequacy. She had not applied for a promotion she was qualified for because she had accepted Daniel's framing of her as someone who struggled under pressure. She had not maintained several friendships that had threatened to give her an external perspective on the relationship. She had not trusted her own judgment on significant financial decisions, deferring instead to Daniel's assessment of her as someone who let emotion cloud her thinking. She had been in the room for 7 years, and she had been made, in that room, into a smaller version of the person who had walked in, not through violence or dramatic coercion. Through the daily patient work of a person who understood that the most efficient way to keep someone contained is to convince them that the container is their own character. The chilling part was not what he had done. The chilling part was how long she had believed it was her. She is not the same person now that she was when she walked into the therapist's office for stress management. She is also not a simplified version of recovered, not the clean narrative of empowerment that the story might seem to want. She is a person who carries the knowledge of what was done to her and who has learned to use that knowledge as the specific kind of education you can only get from surviving something. She applied for the promotion 8 months after leaving. She got it. She has rebuilt 2 of the friendships that the relationship had quietly dissolved. She trusts her own financial judgment now with a precision that comes from having identified the specific mechanism by which that trust was undermined. She is not fearless. She still catches the internal critic, still hears the voice, still occasionally generates the apology before she has thought it through. But the catch time has shortened. The distance between the automatic response and the conscious question has compressed from days to hours to sometimes minutes. That compression is the work. That compression is what recovery actually looks like from the inside, not the dramatic moment of realization, but the daily practice of choosing your own accounting over the one that was installed in you by someone who needed you to be the variable. I want to leave you with what she said at the very end of our conversation because it is the truest and most important thing in this entire story, and I want you to carry it with you wherever you go after this. She said, "The most dangerous betrayal is never the one that announces itself. It is never the one that arrives with evidence you can point to and show other people and say, look, here is what was done to me. The most dangerous betrayal is the one that teaches you to do it to yourself. Because when the person who installed it leaves, the installation stays. And you keep running the program long after the programmer is gone. And the only way to stop running it is to first understand that you are running it. That the voice that tells you that you are too much and not enough and the problem in every room, that voice is not yours. It was given to you. And anything that was given can be returned." She paused. She said, "I returned it. Every day I return a little more of it. And every day there is a little more room in me that belongs only to myself." Thank you for being here on Venom Thread tonight. If this story is somewhere inside your own story, if you recognize something in Iris that you have been carrying without a name for it, please share this. Because the person who needs to hear it cannot find it if you do not help it reach them. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. New darkness next week. And we are nowhere near finished.